be here to talk with all of you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I have some slides that I want to walk through just to kind of lead the discussion. But like Marion said, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm not really very good at doing two things at once. So looking at the chat and speaking, I don't know if I can manage that. But yeah, please feel free to interrupt me if there's any burning questions. And then, you know, at the end, I think we'll leave time. I'll leave plenty of time for sure so that we can talk about any questions anyone has and just have a nice little discussion. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And let me just see if I can make this a little bigger. Okay. So I started off doing this research actually when I was a graduate student at Princeton University. That's what brought me to the Princeton area. And it's interesting because I never really imagined that I'd still be working on my dissertation over 15 years later, but lo and behold, I am. I did get my PhD, you know, from Princeton years ago, but I'm still working on the same questions that essentially I had when I began this journey as a neuroscientist. And so it really started out as this whole idea that maybe there's something about our food environment that is causing people to have such a hard time controlling their diet and to eat the right foods and make the right choices and healthy choices about what they should and shouldn't eat. And, you know, 15, 20 years ago, when I first started doing this research, there was a lot more emphasis on overeating and obesity being associated with a moral failing of the individual. It was the person's fault that they didn't have the willpower to, you know, make those better food choices. And my colleagues and I started talking about this and said, well, you know what, if you take a look at the foods in our environment these days, they look a lot different than they did 50 years ago when fewer people were struggling with food, you know, with obesity and overeating. And so we started to put together this idea that, well, maybe some of these foods that are essentially designer foods, they're processed foods that are made in laboratories and food companies, maybe they're producing an addiction in the way that people can become addicted to things like drugs and alcohol. So that's what really led us down this path of trying to understand whether or not food could actually be addictive. And so we knew that so many people were struggling with being overweight or obese. And despite the fact that there are so many public health warnings, there's so much information out there, there's so many diet programs that are designed to help people figure out what they should and shouldn't eat, many people still struggle with this. We're seeing that, you know, over 2/3 of our country is now struggling with being overweight or obese. And so this is a significant issue that doesn't seem to be going away. And we know that there's a variety of reasons that contribute to it, but we also know that the foods that we consume is one of the big players. So I think it's important to point out obesity is an endpoint and it has multiple contributing factors. I'll often talk about how I don't think there'll ever be a cure for obesity. I think there's going to be multiple cures for obesity. And the reason for that is that there isn't one singular cause of obesity. There's lots of things that contribute to people having a hard time regulating their body weight. Certainly sedentary lifestyle plays a role. We've learned a lot about the fact that we have more sedentary lifestyles these days than we did, let's say, 50 years ago. People aren't working in jobs that require as much manual labor. We've been able to outsource a lot of the physical activity of our jobs to machines or to other countries where other people are doing that physical activity. A lot more people are on the computers and they're doing things where they're not moving around as much. And so that certainly contributes to the fact that we're burning fewer calories as a result. There's also a genetic vulnerability for some individuals to be obese or overweight. And this comes from the fact that if you have parents that are overweight or obese, they can pass on that genetic material that can put you at greater risk for becoming overweight or obese. And as we have more and more people in our population that are struggling with obesity and being overweight and then mating, they're going to create more of a genetic vulnerability. And so this is something that I think we'll be hearing more about as time goes on. Also, food accessibility has changed. It used to be the case that we had to hunt and gather for our food and forage for it, really take a lot of effort to try to find food. But now it's so easy. You can simply, you know, just hop in your car, go to the grocery store, buy 2 weeks worth of groceries, and you're good to go. where you don't even have to get in your car. You can just get on your phone and get Instacart to deliver it, or Fresh Direct, or somebody. And so it's become a lot easier for us to get food and to store it. And that's a good thing, but it also means that we're eating a lot more of it and we're not working as hard to get it. There's also been a lot of changes regarding social norms around food. I think that it's interesting that I keep, for some reason, I don't know why this just keeps popping up on my feed. Maybe it's because I study food for a living, but one of the things that I find to be so kind of disheartening lately is the fact that, we're seeing incentives for people to get the COVID vaccine coming from donut shops where people can get free donuts if they go get a vaccine, which to me is, I get the point of trying to encourage people to get the vaccine, but we're encouraging them to then eat something that's really unhealthy to go along with it. That doesn't really kind of align with the messaging. The social norms regarding food have changed in the sense that, people are essentially welcomed to bring donuts into work, celebrate things with food. Basically we can eat food wherever we want. And this is something that I think has passively contributed to the amount of calories that people are consuming. And it's sort of changed the way in which we look at food as part of the way in which we interact with each other. There's also stress and endocrine factors, which I don't have time to talk about today, but they certainly play a role in contributing to body weight. Changes in portion sizes, we've seen this over the years. Our portion sizes are going up dramatically. If you take a look at what a dinner plate at a restaurant or even a fast food establishment would look like in terms of how much food that they would give you when you sat down, 50 years ago compared to now, it's almost double in size. And so the portions that were being offered, not only in restaurants, but even at home, have changed dramatically, and this certainly can contribute to the amount of food that people end up eating. And then there's also some genetic disorders like Prader-Willi syndrome that can have obesity as one of the side effects. But what I want to talk about today mostly is this whole idea of maybe this new addition to some of these contributing factors. The idea that maybe the rewarding aspect of the food that we eat, the hedonic properties, the stuff that makes it just taste really good, could that play a role? And could that make, in some cases, a food sort of cross the line between being delicious and something that we like a lot to now something that maybe we're addicted to and we can't control our intake of? So before I talk about the addiction piece, I want to take a few minutes to talk about defining what a food is. And this is something that we typically take for granted in terms of definitions. I think when most people say, oh, we're going to go out for food, everybody's kind of on the same page that you're going to get something that you would eat and, it's an edible item. But I think we need to kind of dive a little bit deeper because in my opinion, the term food is being too loosely applied to the substances that we tend to ingest. So let's take some examples. So this is an example of a nutrition facts label. I'm sure you're all very, very familiar with these. Lots of good information here about what you're about to eat. One of the things that's very important is the list of ingredients. And if you take a look at the bottom, you'll see under ingredients, it says that this product contains whole baby carrots, frozen and unprepared. So it doesn't take a lot to figure out that this is whole baby carrots, right? So bag of carrots. Let's take a look at another food. Again, carrots we know are a food. Let's take a look at another example. And so here we have another nutrition facts label. Now this one's not quite so easy. When we take a look at the list of ingredients, we can see that there's a lot of things here. Some of them are good, like there's vitamins in this. This is a product that's being fortified with things like folic acid, which is a very good thing. But there's also a lot of other stuff in here that maybe isn't so great, like canola oil, which isn't the healthiest oil you can consume, corn syrup solids, which is essentially a type of sugar. There's also a lot of things that are added to this particular product to have it be a certain color. So for instance, there's various different dyes down here, like blue 1 Lake, yellow 6, red 40, that really don't serve any nutritional purpose. These are more for aesthetics. So even though whole baby carrots and this particular product are both considered foods, to me, they seem to be very, very different. One, you can plant, carrot seeds out in your garden and grow beautiful carrots on your own. And another one is a man-made concoction of something from a laboratory. This is actually the nutrition facts label for something called Mini Crisp Pop-Tarts, which are marketed pretty heavily towards children as a breakfast item that is easy. You can pop it in the toaster, and it's supposedly something that, you know, kids like to eat. Now, I think you'll agree with me that it is a highly processed food, meaning there's no Mini Crisp Pop-Tart tree we can go buy and plant in our yard. This is something that was created in a laboratory and designed to taste a certain way, to feel a certain way in your mouth, to even smell a certain way when you open up the package. And so this is an example of a highly processed food item. And I don't think that it really belongs in the same category or under the same umbrella as carrots. And so that's why I think we need to be very careful when we talk about the word food to make sure that we're all on the same page with what we're actually talking about. So the big thing about the Mini Crisp Pop-Tarts is, again, it's a highly processed food. So you might say, well, what's the big deal about processing? We process foods all the time. We can foods. You know, you peel the banana before you eat it. That's technically considered processing. You know, you sear a steak before you eat it. I mean, there's lots of different things we do to our food that's considered processing. And that's great, because some of that is a very normal part of the way in which we consume things. It makes the food safe and healthy in many cases. But I think that there are steps that are being taken when it comes to manufacturing these highly processed foods, where we're changing the food from its original form in a way that is now causing it to actually become something completely different. So let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about, how processing can change something. So here's a picture of a coca leaf. This is a leaf that grows in various parts of the world, where, you know, people who are indigenous to those regions will chew on these leaves. And I've been in the field of psychology for, you know, 15 years now, and I have not ever met anyone who is addicted to coca leaves, nor do I have any colleagues who've met anyone of people addicted to coca leaves. However, if you take a coca leaf and you process it, extract some of the ingredients, add some chemicals to it, you could very quickly turn it into something that is highly addictive, such as cocaine or crack cocaine. Now, the same could be said with grapes. Grapes are a delicious fruit, but you can still have a grape-based product and process it, add some other chemicals to it, and change it to be something that for many people can be an addictive substance. So the idea here is maybe the same could be said for some of the foods that we tend to consume. So you could have something that is a wheat-based product, and you could process it, add a bunch of chemicals to it, make it taste a little better with sugar and corn syrup and whatnot, and turn it into something that is still a wheat-based product, but very different. And same with water and I'm sorry, I have asparagus on my mind because this weekend we were harvesting asparagus. This is sugarcane. And so you could have, you know, water and sugarcane, which alone are fine by themselves. People obviously need to drink water to stay hydrated. Where sugarcane is still grown, people chew on it. It's really not something that people have a very difficult time controlling their intake of. But when you process these items, put them together, add some more chemicals, you can very easily turn it into something that people do have a difficult time regulating their intake of. So we started off doing research on sugar, and there's a couple of reasons why. First of all, one of the reasons we wanted to focus in on sugar was because we were trying to be careful scientists, and we wanted to really try to isolate some of the specific ingredients in foods that people seem to find particularly problematic. There had been some data that had come out showing that the amount of sugar that people were consuming was going up over the years, and that was actually correlated with the increase in the obesity epidemic. And so it seemed that maybe there could be a relationship between sugar intake and obesity rates. Also, when we take a look at the data on how much sugar people are consuming, we see that the average American is consuming about between 20 and 22 teaspoons, depending on which data you look at, of added sugar each day, or excuse me, each day. And so this is meant to reflect, you know, the fact that, okay, people are consuming a lot of sugar, presumably, We actually didn't know if this was a lot of sugar or not until a few years ago when we had the new dietary guidelines released, which told us that this was indeed a lot of sugar. It's recommended that we consume no more than 8 to 10 teaspoons of added sugar each day. But we're seeing that still, even with those guidelines having been out for a few years now, that Americans are still consuming way too much added sugar. There's also been some very important papers that have come out in the past couple of years that have directly linked intake of sugar sweetened beverages and also artificially sweetened beverages with a greater risk for mortality in the United States. And so this is one particular paper which I encourage you to take a look at if you haven't come across this yet already. This came out of a group up at Harvard that does a lot of research looking at food and long-term impacts on health. And they essentially discovered with this particular study that consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages was associated with greater mortality risk through cardiovascular disease. And this was an important paper because this is really the first paper to show that consuming too much sugar-sweetened beverages essentially can shorten your life and cause you to have cardiovascular disease and mortality related to that. So as I mentioned, we didn't really know how much sugar was too much sugar. Growing up when I was a kid, my mom, they didn't have guidelines on how much sugar was too much. So, we were kind of just limiting our sugar. And I think, most of us up until this recent time, were just under the impression that, okay, we should try to eat a little bit of sugar and not have too much of it and do it in moderation. But that's not quite so easy, right? We've all learned that it's very difficult to judge how much sugar we're consuming each day and also to figure out where it is because it's in so many different products and it's often hidden in different products. So when these new dietary guidelines came out a few years ago, they told us that we should have no more than 10% of our daily calories coming from added sugar. So this basically boils down to between 10 to 12 teaspoons of added sugar each day. And different organizations will actually argue, for the lesser amount. There was a proposal that was put out for the new iteration of the dietary guidelines that came out in 2021. And the task force that was put together to make the recommendations for 2021 actually recommended that this be reduced to 6% of daily calorie intake. But for some unknown reason, which I still can't get a straight answer on, this was rejected finally by the committee, and they decided to stick with the 10% recommendation, even though the group of scientists that they put together told them that it needed to come down to 6%. So in any case, we really need to restrict how much sugar we're consuming, and now we have information on how we should do that in terms of how much we should be trying to limit ourselves to each day. Now, added sugars doesn't come from things like naturally containing sugar. So fruits obviously are not considered as an added sugar. Vegetables are not considered to be added sugar, and milk is not considered to be added sugar. But I will put the caveat out there that we need to be mindful that, not all fruit, whole fruit that's an apple that you grab in the grocery store or oranges that you pick up, those are fruits, natural fruits. But we have to be careful because a lot of times if you look on the back of food products, they'll be sweetened with things like fruit concentrate. Well, that is an added sugar. That is essentially, the sugar sucked out of the fruit and used as a way to sweeten the product. So whole fruits, whole vegetables, and milks are things that are not considered added sugar. I will point out, though, that with milk, you do need to be mindful because there are a lot of alternative milks out there now, which many of us enjoy, and sometimes they contain added sugar. So you do need to check the label. Almond milk is famous. Unless you scrutinize that label, there's so many different varieties of it in the stores these days. You really do need to be mindful that many of them contain added sugar. So if you're looking to cut back on sugar, you want to make sure that you take a look at that. So this can be difficult, and I think this is where the challenge lies, is that many people want to limit their sugar intake, but there's so many products out there that contain so much sugar that it's really, in many ways, impossible. Here's an example. So here's a picture of a Starbucks caramel frappuccino. This is something that people enjoy occasionally. I know people who enjoy it more than occasionally. And it's a beverage that you can buy, and if you have just one of these, you're going to have 64 grams of sugar, which is 128% of the daily recommended value. So you're already a quarter of the way into tomorrow's sugar allotment if you have just one of these beverages. So let's look at something that's a little healthier. We all know that frappuccinos aren't exactly, on the list of things that are healthy for you, but fruit on the yogurt is, right? Especially if it contains fruit. So we might think that this is a great option, but it actually can have up to 50% of the daily recommended value of sugar. Now, the reason for this is because the fruit on the bottom is actually not really fruit. It's more of a fruit compote, which has a lot of sugar added to it to make it sweet. And so although yogurt is extremely healthy, we do need to be mindful again with the labels, because a lot of times, even though this product is, touted as being 99% fat free, it's 50% of your daily value of sugar. That's probably something that should have to be more apparent on the label.
If I can just say, just interrupt 1 second, just for, because a lot of Americans don't think in terms of grams. 4 grams of sugar is a teaspoon. So
Yes.
when you see that delicious, healthy cup of yogurt that you think you're getting, and it's got 16 grams of sugar, you're really, that little cup has 4 teaspoons, which blows my mind. But anyhow,
Yes.
for
Thank you.
context.
Thank you very much for pointing that out. Yes, absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done on this. When we first started looking at this, my background's in neuroscience, and so we were interested in understanding what happens in reward-related parts of the brain when we eat, especially when we eat these high sugar foods. Now, one of the things we know about the brain is that drugs that are abused actually work on brain systems that reinforce natural behavior. So we have these systems in our brain that make us want to engage in certain species necessary behaviors like mating, like feeding. We have to do these things in order to survive. So it makes sense that our brain would have them coded as being rewarding. And drugs actually usurp these systems. There isn't a separate system to have you get addicted to drugs, or a separate system to have you enjoy sex, or a separate system to have you, want to eat food. It's all essentially one reward system that all these different activities can activate to various degrees. And that's part of the reason why drugs that are abused are so addictive, is because they're able to overactivate this natural system that was put in place to reinforce these natural behaviors. So the point here is we have the architecture and the circuitry in place, in the sense that we could potentially see how these designer foods, these highly processed foods, could overactivate these brain pathways in ways that resemble drugs of abuse. So what we did was, and what we're still doing essentially, is really just trying to understand whether we could become addicted to highly processed foods and whether sugar plays a role in that. And so what we ended up doing is to take the criteria that are used by doctors to diagnose someone as having an addiction or a substance use disorder. And these are laid out in a book called the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, the 5th edition. And this is basically a book that the American Psychiatric Association puts out that catalogs the criteria that people need to meet in order to be diagnosed with a variety of different mental illnesses and mental disorders, such as substance use disorder. And so I won't take the time to kind of go through all these. We can talk about any that people have questions about, but essentially there's criteria in which someone has to show that they have some impaired control. So they might be binging, they might want to quit but really can't. They might spend an excessive amount of time thinking about using the substance or craving the substance. There also is a social impairment criteria. And so someone who might be dependent on drugs or alcohol, you can clearly see how, because it's illegal to do drugs and to use alcohol at work and things like that, they could easily have a failure to fulfill their major role obligations. And so if they're using the substance, they can get in trouble for it. With food, this one's a little bit tricky because our social norms around food are such that it's completely welcomed for people to be eating essentially nonstop and bring food to whatever event they want, bring food into work. So this one can be a little bit difficult to map onto just because our social norms have changed. But again, showing some sort of social impairment is one of the criteria that's put out there when talking about someone having an addiction. Also, risky use, using the substance despite the fact that it's physically hazardous, or using it even though we know it's causing us physical or psychological problems. And then there's also some pharmacological criteria. This has to do with the nature of the way that the substance acts in our body and our brains. And in many cases, that can produce tolerance. This is where you might feel euphoria from the substance after just a little bit of it. feel good after a little bit of it. But then as you consume that substance over and over again, you just feel like you need more and more and more of it in order to feel that good feeling you felt the first time. Alcohol is a good example for this. When people first start drinking alcohol, they might feel intoxicated or a little buzzed or relaxed off of maybe one beverage. But when people end up drinking regularly, they find that they need more and more in order to feel that effect because they've developed tolerance. Also, withdrawal. This can happen with drugs of abuse, where if they're deprived of the drug of abuse, there's a variety of things that can happen. People can become irritable. People can become extremely ill, like in the case of opiate withdrawal. And so when someone is having prolonged and heavy use of a substance, a withdrawal can occur. And this is something that is one of the symptoms that's associated with substance abuse disorder. So what we essentially did, and I want to walk through just a couple of our data slides, was to see if we could first see this happening in an animal model. And so we were using our little lab rats, in part because it's really difficult to find subjects to be in experiments that are humans that have never had sugar before. And so we wanted to have a way to look at the effects of sugar on the brain, but we needed people who were naive of sugar, and that's not something that's very easy to come across. And so we're able to do that with our lab rats. We're able to have different groups that have different experiences with sugar. And one of the things that we noted is that the rats that were given sugar to drink in a binge type schedule, so that means they were allowed to have it 12 hours a day, they ended up showing signs of tolerance. So you can see on the left, they're drinking more and more sugar. In this case, the sugar was sucrose, over the course of a 21-day experiment each day. So they're drinking more than even rats that had the sugar available ad libitum, or 24 hours a day. And so this is evidence of tolerance. There's also evidence that these animals are binging. When we give the rats sugar on the first day, when we give the rats the 12-hour access to sugar, that's the black column, they drink it, it tastes good. There's also a group that we ran that only gets sugar on the first day of the experiment and the last day of the experiment. And then we have a group that gets sugar 24 hours a day. And you can see on day one, there's really no difference between the groups and how much sugar they drink. They all liked it and drank it. But if you look on day 21, it's the rats with the limited access, the 12-hour daily access, that are binging on it. And they're showing this large intake of sugar when they get access to it. Now, one might say, okay, well, if you give me 12 hours of access to anything, I'll consume a lot of it. It's more of like a, abstinence makes the heart grow fonder type of effect. So we tested for that. We had a control group where the rats get just 12 hours a day access to their healthy rat food, which is kind of like, tastes like cardboard / salad. It's not exactly palatable. Sugar tastes much better. But these animals, even though they only have 12 hours a day access to it, they eat the same on day 1 and day 21. They just eat it in a shorter window. So there's something special about the sugar that seems to promote binging and tolerance. Now, one of the things that we were most interested in was understanding what was happening with a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine is something that is released in response to drugs of abuse. Every time somebody uses a drug of abuse, smokes a cigarette, drinks alcohol, it releases dopamine in that reward-related brain region. That's really the hallmark of drug abuse. But what we've noted is that with food, dopamine is not released every single time a person eats food. It's usually only released when someone's eating a novel food or a food that they've never tasted before. If you have, eat a hamburger for the first time, you're going to release dopamine because it's new and different and your brain's paying attention in case it makes you sick. But the second, third, fourth time you eat a hamburger, you're not going to release dopamine in response to it. So we wonder what was going to happen when our rats were binging on sugar. Are they going to release dopamine every time, like an animal would if they were getting a drug, or are they going to act more like what would happen with a food? And what we ended up finding was that the animals that are binging on sugar end up releasing dopamine every single time they get it. Day 1, day 2, and even out onto 21 days into the experiment. Now, our control groups were also getting sugar and drinking it, but they're not showing that release of dopamine like we would expect to see with a drug. They're showing the typical response to a food. So there's something special, again, about having binge access, overeating sugar, that's causing it to behave in the brain more like a drug and less like what we'd see with food. We've done a lot of experiments on this. I want to kind of go a little quickly through this. I'm happy to send anybody who wants after the fact the slides, because I want to get to some of the human data that I have. We've looked for signs of withdrawal and all the other DSM criteria I talked about a few minutes ago, and we've been able to essentially note them all. We've seen that animals who are overeating sugar will show signs of anxiety. If we take the sugar away, they'll show signs of depression. They'll show somatic indications like changes in blood pressure, just different behavioral changes that are consistent with the fact that they're in a case of withdrawal that is similar to what you'd see with a mild case of opiate withdrawal. Now, we've looked at some of this clinically as well, and I think this is important because, obviously one of the questions that we have is, okay, let's move beyond sugar, because we know that sugar is an important component of the highly processed foods, but people don't eat sugar in isolation, they eat it in combinations with other things. And so we've begun to do some research in that area in some of our human studies. We've been utilizing something called the Yale Food Addiction Scale, and this was actually created to be able to understand whether or not we can measure food addiction in human subjects. So a group that was up at Yale, when we were doing our work at Princeton, a couple of years later, they started to do this work and essentially took those DSM criteria and developed a scale that tweaked the questions to have it be about food instead of about drugs. So it asks things like, find myself continuing to consume certain foods even though I'm no longer hungry, or I eat to the point where I feel ill. And then the person can simply answer these questions, and it's very easy to administer. So there's been a lot of findings from this scale. The scale's been out for a while now, and lots of people have used it in research. And the bottom line is that we see in undergraduates, which is typically how you test out a new scale, 11% meet the criteria for having a food addiction. Now, you might say, well, that doesn't sound like that much, but 11% of the population actually meets the criteria for having a drug or alcohol addiction. So it's kind of on par with what we would expect. But if we focus in on those that are more at risk, we see that the numbers go up. So individuals who struggle with obesity, one study showed that 25% met the criteria for having food addiction. And if we look at individuals who have obesity and comorbid binge eating disorder, then studies show that the numbers go up to over 50% having the criteria for food addiction. Also, there's been some studies that have looked at the brain using fMRI and other techniques in humans that nicely dovetail with our earlier rat research, showing that the higher the scores on the food addiction scale, the greater the brain activity in response to food stimuli. And so this suggests that, especially because these activities are happening in reward-related brain regions, that there does seem to be a correlation between food addiction and brain activity in response to highly palatable foods. So last thing I'm going to talk about, and then I want to open us up to have some time for questions, is, one of the things that we've most recently been interested in is trying to understand which foods are addictive. And so my lab partnered with the group that developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale. Ashley Gerhardt, she and I are actually good friends. She's a professor at the University of Michigan. And what we wanted to see was which foods are most addictive. And so we conducted a study using Amazon MTurk to allow us to give a greater representation of the population. And then we also conducted the study using undergraduate students. And what we were able to find is that the most addictive foods were identified as being pizza, chocolate, chips, cookies, and ice cream. And I'm sure this is of no shock to anyone. And the least addictive foods are found to be cucumbers, carrots, beans, apples, and brown rice. So this was our first way of trying to catalog which foods could meet the criteria for being addictive. And certainly, there's a laundry list of foods that we need to test and that we can include. We only had 35 foods to choose from in this particular study, but it's really the first step in trying to better understand this. And importantly, it's the first empirical step. One of the funny things that, came about after we published this study and the universities did press releases on it, many of the reporters that we were talking to would say, why'd you have to do a study to prove something? We all knew that pizza was addictive. Like, we didn't get what, and, it's true. Most people think pizza's addictive and chocolate's addictive, but this is actually the first empirical evidence of it. So we have data to back up what we've all kind of already known, which is an important part of the process. Also, one other important thing that came out of this study was that we were able to identify predictors associated with problematic eating or addictive eating. And the largest positive predictor was the level of processing. So the more highly processed the food, the more likely it was to be associated with addictive overeating. Now, I think this is important because we need the food industry, right? We need people to make our food for us. There's just not enough farms to feed anyone anymore. And so I don't think that we need to completely get rid of processed food, but I think we need to be able to work with the food companies to make the processed foods less processed. If we can show that, you know, a pizza from Domino's is more addictive than a pizza that's made with, you know, 3 simple ingredients, then that's going to go a long way in helping us better understand the healthier way to prepare pizza. And so these are the types of pieces of information that can be helpful moving forward so that we can still have the foods that people want to enjoy, but be able to advise on how we can have them prepared in a healthier way that's not going to promote problematic or addictive eating. Okay, so I have a couple of things here I'm just going to kind of skip over. I'll end by saying that one of the things that I often hear in terms of pushback when I talk about food addiction from people is, well, is it really like a drug addiction? We tend to think about drug addiction in our society as being like the people who are pictured in the top image. And yes, this is certainly an awful part of addiction and something that as a society we need to control better and deal with better. But we need to keep in mind that the loss of control that people typically think of when it comes to addiction doesn't have to be as extreme as we typically think. And that's because it's often dictated by social norms and societal norms. And it turns out that the most common addict in our society is likely a fully functioning individual, somebody with little noticeable intoxication. Their withdrawal syndrome is not life-threatening, but because of smoking's health-related complications, it is still the #1 preventable cause of death in the US. So I think if we're going to think about addiction to food, we need to think about it in the way that we think about nicotine addiction. And for those on the Zoom who are old enough to remember, and I'm one of them, we've seen that the world has changed a lot in terms of how we view smoking. We've gone from the extreme of it being something that doctors endorsed doing and dentists said was fine to do and not bad for you, to now flash forward having, you know, legislation in place to make sure that it's limited in terms of advertising and that there's restrictions on where people can smoke and there's warnings on the box. And so we've gone a long way in the field of understanding how nicotine and how smoking can harm our health. And it'll be interesting to see what unfolds over the next 20 years or so in terms of food. But I think it's important that when we talk about addiction, we keep this in mind, that the smoker is still the most common addict. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and that way we can have some time for some questions. I want to just first thank, of course, the people who funded the research over the years. I also have a TED Ed video that I recommend. It's called How Sugar Affects Your Brain. If you just Google my name, it pops up. It's also on my website. Definitely check that out. It's a 5-minute animated video I did with them. It's really great. I've gotten a lot of good feedback on it. And it's got 11 million views, which I'm proud of because I didn't think a nerdy little science video would ever be viewed that many times, but people seem to really like it. And I want to share my contact information and definitely check out my website if you're interested in learning more. And I'm on social media as @Dr. Nicole Avina. So if you're interested in learning about articles or just different things related to nutrition and health, definitely follow me because I often share stuff related to that. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Avina. This is
okay. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Oh, it's wonderful. Thank you.